The cold came through the stone first, always, not through the windows, not through the gap beneath the service door, but through the floor itself, through the soles of Eleanor Voss's thin shoes, up through her ankles and into the bones of her legs, a reminder that Ashford Hall had been standing for 200 years and intended to stand for 200 more without particular concern for the living people moving through it. She was standing in the entrance hall when the carriages began to arrive, holding a clipboard of linen paper lists in her left hand and a stub of pencil in her right, counting napkins. Not the guests, not the floral arrangements that had required 3 days of correspondence with a London supplier and one very sharp letter from Eleanor herself, composed at midnight and dispatched before dawn. Not the musicians, who had arrived an hour early and were now eating bread in the kitchen against explicit instruction. She was counting napkins because someone had to, and in the 12 months since her aunt, Lady Marbury, had announced that Ashford Hall would host the betrothal party of Sir Edmund Holt and Lady Caroline Fenn, not a single person with authority over the household had thought to verify that there were enough napkins for 140 guests. There were, as of this moment, 112. And at the edge of all that candlelit magnificence, the chandeliers blazing, the hothouse roses arranged in towers, the silk-draped guests filtering through the entrance hall like a river of expensive cloth, was Eleanor Voss, doing arithmetic in a margin. She was 27. She wore a gray dress that had been new in 1812 and was now, in the winter of 1817, simply her dress, the one she wore when she needed to move through a room without being mistaken for a guest. Her dark hair was pinned without ornament. She had no jewels because the jewels that might once have been hers, her mother's small pearl earrings, her grandmother's garnet brooch, had been sold 4 years ago to settle the debt her cousin Gerald had quietly accumulated against the estate, while Eleanor was managing everything else. The Sinclair jewels were not hers. Everyone in the room understood that, except perhaps Eleanor herself, who had not yet looked up from her list. They were on Lady Caroline Fenn's neck, a collar of deep sapphires set in silver, with a pendant drop that caught the candlelight and threw it in 4 directions at once. Eleanor had seen them in the Sinclair family inventory. She had catalogued them herself 3 years ago when the late Duke of Sinclair had died and the estate had passed to his son, and the household had asked, or rather, her aunt had volunteered Eleanor's services, for someone to manage the inventory, the creditors, the tenant accounts, the solicitor's correspondence, and the question of what exactly had been promised to whom. She had not been paid for that work. She had been given a room at Ashford Hall in the understanding that gratitude was its own compensation. She wrote 28 additional napkins in the margin of her list and circled it twice. The man who came through the entrance hall at 7 minutes past 8 was not announced. He did not require announcement. He was tall enough that the footman at the door had to adjust his posture slightly, some involuntary animal recalibration, and his coat was dark and precisely fitted, and he wore no decorations except a single watch chain. He looked at the chandeliers with the expression of a man who had seen chandeliers before. He looked at the roses with the expression of a man who had authorized someone to spend money on them. He looked at Lady Caroline Fenn in the sapphire collar with the expression of a man reading a document in a language he had not chosen to learn. His name was James Sinclair, the 5th Duke of Sinclair. He had been in Scotland for 14 months. He was looking at the sapphires. Then, because he was the kind of man who always eventually found the thing in a room that was doing actual work, his gaze moved across the entrance hall and settled on a woman in a gray dress who was writing in a margin and had not looked up. He stood there for 3 full seconds, which was unusual for a man who did not stand still in public. Then Lady Caroline materialized at his left elbow, gloved hand extended, and his attention moved because it had to, and Eleanor Voss went back to her list. She did not notice that he had looked. She had been counting napkins. To understand why Eleanor Voss was standing in an entrance hall doing invisible work at a party that celebrated other people's fortune, it was necessary to understand what her life had been for the previous 6 years, which was to say, everything that everyone else found inconvenient. Her father, Thomas Voss, had died in the spring of 1811, leaving behind a modest but workable estate in Wiltshire, 200 acres of tenant farmland, a house in reasonable repair, and a daughter who had spent the previous 4 years sitting beside him in his study, learning everything he knew about how to run it. He had not done this because he believed in female education, particularly. He had done it because Eleanor was the only one who listened, and because the tenant accounts were not going to organize themselves, and because his son, her brother Charles, had gone to university and shown every sign of staying there. Thomas Voss died of a fever in April. In June, Charles came home and spent 3 months trying to manage the estate before announcing that he could not actually do this and departing again for Bath. In September, Eleanor sat down at her father's desk and took over. She was 21 years old. She had the accounts in full order within 6 weeks. She had the 3 outstanding creditor negotiations resolved by Christmas, one of them by writing a letter so precisely organized, laying out the timeline of payments, the interest calculations, the estate's liquid position, and the proposal for settlement in 4 numbered paragraphs, that the creditor in question had sent back a note saying simply, "Agreed," on the terms stated. She managed the tenant renewals in February. She arranged the spring planting schedule with the farm manager, a man 20 years her senior who had initially communicated with her through terse written notes as though she were a relay station for some authority that did not exist, and who by the following autumn was coming directly to her desk and sitting down. She managed the estate for 3 years. She did not receive a salary because Charles remained nominally in charge, and it did not occur to him to pay her, and it did not occur to Eleanor to ask, because asking would have required acknowledging that she was working, and acknowledging that she was working would have required someone to take formal notice of it, and no one in 1811 was prepared to formally notice a 21-year-old woman managing an estate. Then Charles sold the estate. He came home in the spring of 1814, sat in the study that had been their father's and was functionally Eleanor's, and told her he'd had an offer from a textile merchant in Bristol who wanted the land for expansion. He had accepted it. The house went with it. They would have the proceeds, minus certain debts he had accumulated that Eleanor had not known about because Charles had been careful not to tell her. When the settlement was calculated, Eleanor's share came to £42. She had stood in the doorway of that study for a long moment, her list of spring accounts in her hand, and she had pressed one hand briefly against the doorframe and breathed, not because she was going to break. She was not going to break, but because the moment required acknowledgement before she could move past it. She picked up the spring accounts. She filed them where they belonged. She wrote the farm manager a letter explaining the transfer of title and thanking him for his service, and she packed what she owned into 2 trunks. Her aunt, Lady Marbury, had offered the room at Ashford Hall. It was not a gift. Eleanor arrived and within a fortnight had been assigned to manage the household accounts, the staff correspondence, the supplier negotiations, and something her aunt referred to, with an airy wave, as the general administration. There was no agreement stating what Eleanor would be paid, or what she would be owed, or what her position was. She was a relation. She lived in the house. The work was simply there to be done. She had done it for 3 years, and she was very good at it, and no one thought of it as skill. They thought of it the way people thought of weather or gravity, simply a reliable condition of the environment. There was one moment, the winter of her 2nd year at Ashford Hall, when a letter had come from a solicitor in London regarding a disputed clause in the estate's wool supply contract, a clause that had allowed the merchant to revise pricing quarterly without written notice, which meant the estate had been overpaying by approximately £400 annually for 11 years without realizing it. Eleanor had read the clause, had gone back to the previous 6 years of supplier invoices, had drafted a response to the solicitor, and had attached a table showing each year's overcharge with the original contract language alongside the invoice figures. The solicitor had written back to her aunt, "Your advisor's analysis is correct. We will pursue recovery for the 3 most recent years." Her aunt had read the letter aloud at breakfast and said, "Well, the solicitor has sorted it," and Eleanor had picked up her tea and continued eating. She was not going to become less than she was because no one was keeping proper score. The moment that had brought James Sinclair to Ashford Hall's entrance hall on a January evening was not, as the guests present might have assumed, the betrothal party. He had been in Scotland for 14 months, completing what his estate manager called necessary consolidation, which meant reviewing 14 years of decisions made by proxy, since his father had died when James was 22, and he had spent much of the intervening period at a distance from a title he had not wanted, and a family seat that felt, as he put it to no one, like a place he was supposed to love rather than a place he did. His mother had loved it. His mother had died when he was 11, in the West Wing in November, of a chill that became a fever, that became something no one had a word for in 1797. He remembered her in pieces, her voice in the music room, the smell of lavender, the particular sound of the piano playing after supper when he was supposed to be asleep. He had not been back in the music room in 14 years. He had not, in fact, opened the door. The man who had returned from Scotland was 33 years old, controlled, strategic, and not cruel. His coldness was the kind that comes from a long time spent keeping the interior separate from the exterior. Not from indifference, but from the opposite of it. He felt things thoroughly. He did not discuss them. He had received a report. His solicitor in London, Edward Marsh, 62, semi-retired, with the particular directness of a man who had outlasted several dukes, had sent a letter to Scotland in November that contained, alongside the usual estate summaries, a paragraph that James had read 3 times before setting it down. "With regard to the Ashford Hall household accounts for the past 3 years," the paragraph read, "it is my professional observation that they have been maintained with a degree of accuracy and structural clarity I have not encountered in 20 years of estate practice. I understand from the Marbury solicitor that these accounts are prepared by a Miss Eleanor Voss, a relation of Lady Marbury's who maintains no formal position. I thought you should know, because I thought someone should tell you, because I believe no one has told her." James had folded the letter. He had put it in his coat pocket. He had taken it out the following morning and read it again. He had then written to the Ashford Hall household, not to Lady Marbury, but through her solicitor, requesting access to the Sinclair estate wool supply correspondence from the previous 4 years, which his own estate manager told him had been managed through a Wiltshire intermediary. What came back was not correspondence. What came back was a bound set of accounts, annotated in a small, precise hand, with a separate note explaining the quarterly pricing clause discrepancy, the basis for the recovery claim, and a suggestion, offered without any expectation that it would be taken up, for a revised contract structure that would prevent the same problem recurring. No name on the note, unsigned. He recognized the handwriting from the accounts. He had attended the betrothal party because Lady Marbury had sent an invitation, and he was in Wiltshire, and it would have been notable to refuse. He had not come to see the sapphires. He had not come to see Lady Caroline Fenn, who was generally considered his natural match by everyone who had arranged society's categories without consulting him. He had come because there was a woman in that house who had done something remarkable and received no acknowledgment for it, and he was finding, in the way that things become clear when you have been alone in Scotland for 14 months with too much time for honest thinking, that this was not something he intended to simply note and move on from. He stood in the entrance hall long enough to identify her, which took less than 30 seconds, because she was the only person in the room who was working, and then Lady Caroline was at his elbow, and the evening's obligations resumed. He did not stop watching the gray dress. Ashford Hall in January was a different problem from Ashford Hall in summer, and Eleanor had been managing the winter version for 3 years with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to anticipate what will go wrong before it does. The East Wing fireplaces had a flue problem that meant the flues had to be manually checked before any fire was lit or the drawing room filled with smoke. The kitchen supplier in Marlborough delivered late in winter because the road from the north was unreliable after frost, which meant Eleanor ordered a week in advance and stored against delay. The fourth step on the main staircase had a loose board that had been reported 3 times to the household steward and not repaired, and Eleanor had begun placing a folded cloth against it during evening events, so that no one in thin evening slippers turned an ankle. These were not small things. They were the substance of an event running without incident which looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. She had the napkin problem resolved by 8:30. The kitchen linen closet held 14 cloths that were not the formal pattern, but were close enough, and Eleanor pressed them herself with the kitchen iron and had them folded and distributed to the correct tables before the first course. The musician who had eaten the bread was quietly redirected to the gallery. The East Wing flue was checked. The folded cloth was placed on the 4th step. She did not sit down. There was no seat at these events that was hers. She was in the morning room at 20 minutes to 9, reviewing the seating arrangement against the list her aunt had revised 4 times in the previous week, when she heard the door. She did not look up immediately, because people came through that door all evening, guests who had lost their way or wanted a quiet moment, and it was her habit to offer a silent direction and return to her work. "Miss Voss." She looked up. The Duke of Sinclair was standing in the doorway of the morning room, his coat dark against the lit hallway behind him, his expression the particular arrangement of someone who has come somewhere with a specific purpose. She set down her pencil. "Your Grace, you are managing this evening," he said. It was not a question. It was a precise observation, delivered without the exclamation point that a social person would have added. "I am assisting Lady Marbury with the arrangements," she said. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at the revised seating chart. He looked at the neatly stacked correspondence on the morning room table that she had been using as a temporary desk. "The annotated accounts," he said. "The wool supply correspondence. That was your work." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the musicians beginning in the gallery 2 corridors away. "I prepared the accounts," she said. "Your solicitor's letter went to Lady Marbury." "I know where the letter went," he said. "I wanted to know where the work came from." Eleanor held his gaze with the particular stillness of someone who has been passed over so many times that surprise has stopped being possible. "I've managed the household accounts for 3 years," she said. "The wool supply analysis was an extension of that. The clause identification alone was work a London solicitor would charge 40 guineas for," he said. "The recovery analysis was worth considerably more." She said nothing. He was not wrong. She had known he was not wrong at the time. He crossed the room, not toward her but to the window which looked out onto the dark garden, and stood there for a moment with his hands behind his back. She noticed that his posture was the same at rest as it was in motion, contained, precisely vertical, like a well-built bridge that had stopped bothering to demonstrate its own load-bearing capacity. "I have an estate," he said, "Sinclair House, in addition to the London property. 3,000 acres, 14 tenant farms, a wool operation that has been consistently mismanaged since my father died, and a household that has gone through 4 estate managers in 6 years. Eleanor waited. "I am looking for someone who can actually run it," he said. He turned from the window. "Not advise, not assist. Run it. Manage the accounts. Negotiate the supply contracts. Oversee the tenant renewals. Manage the household operations." "You are describing an estate manager's position," she said. "I am describing the work I need done," he said. "The title can be whatever is appropriate." She looked at him for a moment. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I think you should know that I am not a credentialed solicitor or a formally trained accountant. My experience is practical and self-administered." "I know what your experience is," he said. "I read your accounts." She felt something shift behind her sternum. Not dramatically, not like anything she would have named aloud, but the particular internal movement of something that had been braced for a long time and had just been offered, unexpectedly, a reason to stand differently. She picked up her pencil. She set it back down. "I will consider it," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected either an immediate yes or an immediate no, and had received neither, and found this both unexpected and correct. "Good," he said. And then, before he turned to leave, "Your aunt's fourth-step staircase board has been loose since at least last spring. I stepped over the cloth tonight." "It has been reported 3 times," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow it will be reported a 4th time," he said, "with my name attached to it." He left. Eleanor stood in the morning room for approximately 15 seconds, then picked up her seating list and went back to work. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue, but this had not looked like rescue. It had looked like a man who had read her work and arrived to tell her so, which was something different entirely. The situation complicated itself, as situations tended to do, before she had resolved it. Lady Caroline Fenn wore the Sinclair sapphires to the betrothal ceremony the following Saturday, which was held in the Ashford Hall drawing room before 43 witnesses. The sapphires were a loan, technically. They had been offered by the Sinclair estate agent as a gesture of social connection before James's return from Scotland, as the kind of thing that suggested a match the Duke himself had neither proposed nor endorsed. Eleanor was in the drawing room because she had arranged it. She was in the back of the room because that was where she stood. Sir Edmund Holt was positioned at the front, looking prosperous and pleased. Lady Caroline stood beside him in green silk with the sapphires at her throat, each stone catching the winter light through the drawing room windows. The officiant cleared his throat. The door opened. James Sinclair walked into the drawing room in a way that was not dramatic, because dramatic was not his method. He simply walked in, and the room noticed him the way rooms notice structural change, not with a sound, but with a collective adjustment. 43 people rearranged themselves inwardly. He walked to the front. He said, in the particular voice of a man who has decided something and is delivering the information, "I believe there is a misunderstanding about the sapphires." Lady Caroline's chin came up. "They are not available as a loan," he said. He looked at the officiant. "I apologize for the interruption. Please continue the moment I have addressed this." He looked at Sir Edmund with neither hostility nor warmth. The estate agent who arranged the loan did not have authority to do so. The sapphires are Sinclair property. They will be returned to Sinclair House. "This is a betrothal ceremony," Lady Caroline said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. "I see that," he said. "I am not interrupting the ceremony. I am correcting a property question. The sapphires will need to be returned tonight." There was a suspended moment in the room. Not eruption, not collapse, but the particular held breath of 43 people recalibrating. Lady Caroline said very quietly, "Are you humiliating me?" "No," he said. "I am retrieving family property that was offered without authority." He paused. "I regret that the timing is inconvenient." He stepped back. He turned. His gaze moved through the room with the efficient directness of someone who was looking for a specific thing and when it reached the back of the drawing room, it stopped. Eleanor had gone very still. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he turned back to the room and said, "Please carry on," and stood to one side, and the betrothal ceremony of Sir Edmund Holt and Lady Caroline Fenn proceeded, with the sapphires still at her throat because no one removed them in the middle of a formal ceremony, and that was not actually what he had been stopping. Eleanor understood this in the way she understood most things, not immediately, but within 20 minutes, after she had returned to the morning room and sat down and thought about it precisely. He had not come to stop the ceremony. He had come to demonstrate, in front of 43 witnesses, that the sapphires had been deployed without his knowledge and that their presence at Lady Caroline's neck did not mean what the social machinery had decided it meant. He had come to remove an assumption from the room. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table and then went back to her list. The decision to accept the position at Sinclair House was not made in that moment. It was made 3 days later, in her room, with the lamp turned low and a sheet of paper on which she had written, on one side, the specific things she knew how to do, and on the other, the specific things the Sinclair estate needed. The lists matched with an exactness that felt, in the private language she allowed herself before dawn, like proof of something. She went to see Lady Marbury the following morning and gave her notice. Her aunt received this with the expression of someone who has been informed that a load-bearing wall has decided to relocate. "You cannot simply leave," Lady Marbury said. "I can," Eleanor said. "I will need 3 weeks to bring the accounts current and prepare a full handover document. I'll have everything organized." "Eleanor, this is entirely inappropriate. I have been working without a formal agreement or compensation for 3 years, Eleanor said, not with anger, with precision. "I have managed this household's accounts, its supplier contracts, its staff correspondence, and its creditor negotiations. I have done this well. I am now being offered a position that acknowledges the work. I intend to take it." Lady Marbury was quiet for a moment. "The Duke of Sinclair," she said finally, "is not offering you anything appropriate. He is offering me an estate manager's position," Eleanor said. "I am accepting it on the basis of the work, which I am qualified to perform. The arrangement will be formal and properly documented." She stood. She returned to her room. She began the handover document. 3 weeks later, with the handover complete and her 2 trunks packed, she stepped into the carriage that had been sent from Sinclair House and did not look back at Ashford Hall. She had managed considerably more than Ashford Hall. She could manage this. Sinclair House was 3 miles from a market town in Wiltshire, set at the end of a long approach road lined with limes that had not been properly maintained in several years. The house itself was large and well built, 3 stories, stone, with the particular solidity of something constructed for the next 200 years rather than for the current decade. The west wing had been the original structure. The east wing had been added by the second Duke and was marginally newer and marginally colder. The estate manager's office was off the main corridor, with 2 windows facing the kitchen garden and a desk that had clearly been used by 3 different people with 3 different systems, none of which had survived the transition to the next person. The housekeeper met Eleanor at the door. Her name was Mrs. Fellows, 61, efficient, with a direct way of speaking that established her position without requiring a speech. "The accounts are in a state," Mrs. Fellows said, showing Eleanor the office. "The last manager left in September and there wasn't anyone in the position between September and now. His Grace was in Scotland. I've kept what I could keep." "I can see that," Eleanor said, looking at the desk. She meant it as a compliment, which Mrs. Fellows appeared to receive correctly. "We've 14 tenant farms," Mrs. Fellows said. 11 in reasonable order, 3 that want attention. I'll tell you which 3 and why if you want." "I do want," Eleanor said. This afternoon, if possible. Mrs. Fellows looked at her with the expression of someone who has been prepared for something difficult and has received something workable. Tea first, she said. You've been in a carriage for 2 hours. Eleanor allowed tea. She had the desk organized by the end of the first day. She had the accounts reviewed and indexed by the end of the second. She had the outstanding creditor positions mapped by the end of the third, and on the morning of the fourth day she went to see the Duke of Sinclair in his study and placed before him a single sheet of paper. The estate has 3 operational problems, she said. The first is the wool merchant contract, which has a pricing structure I believe was revised without appropriate notice in 1814 and needs to be renegotiated. The second is the drainage on the North Tenant farms. There has been consistent water damage to the winter barley for at least 4 years, which is showing in the yield figures, and explains a significant portion of the rental income shortfall. The third is the household purchasing, which is being done by 4 different people using 4 different accounts with no consolidated record, which means the estate is almost certainly paying for things more than once. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. You've been here 4 days, he said. The accounts were legible, she said, once they were indexed. He was quiet for a moment. How long to address all 3? The purchasing consolidation I can do immediately. The contract renegotiation will take 6 to 8 weeks depending on how resistant the merchant is. The drainage is a capital question. I'll need the farm manager's assessment and a builder's estimate before I can give you a figure. Talk to Birch about the drainage. He's the head tenant on the North Farms. Been there 20 years. He paused. He won't make it easy. That's fine, Eleanor said. He didn't make it easy for the last 3 managers either, the Duke said. I've read his rental renewal correspondence, Eleanor said. He's not obstructive. He's exhausted. He's been managing water damage without resources for 4 years. If someone comes with an actual proposal rather than another acknowledgement, he'll work with them. The Duke regarded her with the particular stillness that was his version of close attention. All right, he said. Go and see Birch. She went. She brought the drainage records. She sat at Birch's kitchen table for an hour while he explained the problem in the specific language of someone who had been explaining it to people who didn't listen, and she took notes in her small, precise hand, and at the end she said, I'd like to come back with a builder on Thursday to walk the North Field. Would that work for you? And Birch looked at her for a long moment and said, Thursday's fine. It was the first week. The opposition assembled itself with the quiet efficiency of machinery that had been waiting for an appropriate moment. It arrived in 3 forms. The first was Lady Wexford, who came to Sinclair House for tea in the 3rd week, and spent an hour communicating, in the particular language of social precision, that a woman of Miss Voss's background managing a ducal estate was a thing that caused her some concern. Lady Wexford was not cruel. She was the system given a face and a teacup. She had a daughter who had been, until James Sinclair returned from Scotland, generally considered the appropriate next Duchess of Sinclair, and she communicated this not by saying it, but by the particular angle of her chin when she looked at Eleanor, and the specific questions she asked about Eleanor's connections, her family, her previous positions. Eleanor answered each question precisely, without embellishment, without apology. Your family is from Wiltshire, I understand, Lady Wexford said. My father managed 200 acres in the western county, Eleanor said. I learned estate accounting there before managing my cousin's household and then Lady Marbury's. I have been in estate management for 6 years. Formally, Lady Wexford said. Continuously, Eleanor said. The formality is a recent addition. Lady Wexford looked at her with the expression of someone who has played a card and found the other player holding a more interesting hand than expected. She sipped her tea and changed the subject and left at 4 o'clock precisely. Eleanor watched the carriage go from the morning room window and then returned to the supplier invoices. The second form arrived in the person of James Sinclair's father's oldest friend and the family's senior advisor, Lord Hadley, a man of 67, who had known the fourth Duke intimately and regarded the fifth Duke's choices with the particular wariness of someone who had watched the family navigate the previous generation's consequences. He came in the fourth week, unannounced, and spent an hour with the Duke in the study before asking, with the air of a man conducting an inspection, to speak with the woman managing the accounts. Eleanor was brought in. He looked at her with the assessing regard of someone who has a clear idea of what the categories are and is finding this example insufficient for any of them. "Miss Voss," he said, "I understand you've made some changes to the estate operations." "I've reorganized the purchasing accounts and begun a contract renegotiation," she said. "The drainage proposal is with the builder for pricing." "You've been here 4 weeks," he said. "Yes," she said. "The Duke of Sinclair's position requires a household in good social order," Lord Hadley said. "There are questions being asked in the county about the nature of your role here." "I imagine there are," Eleanor said. "The role is estate manager. The nature of it is the management of the estate accounts and operations. I can show you the current account organization if that would be helpful." He regarded her for a moment. He had expected either defensiveness or deference and had received neither. "I am not here to review accounts," he said. "I am here to advise the Duke." "Of course," she said. "Is there a specific aspect of the estate operations you'd like me to address for your advisory purposes?" He looked at her for a long moment. He was not unintelligent. He could see the quality of the work in the way the morning room had been organized, in the indexed binders on the shelf behind her that had not been there 4 weeks ago, in the single sheet she was holding, which was clearly a structured supplier comparison. "The wool contract," he said, finally, as though choosing a test. She handed him the supplier comparison without being asked. She had prepared it that morning. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change, exactly, but there was a recalibration, small, almost invisible, the adjustment of a man who has come prepared to see one thing and has found another. "These figures are current?" he said. "As of Tuesday," she said. "The merchant has responded to our initial renegotiation letter. Their counter is on the second page." He turned to the second page. He was quiet for considerably longer. "This is sound work," he said finally. He did not say it warmly. He said it the way a man says a thing he has concluded is accurate and would rather not have needed to say. He set the paper down. "I will speak with His Grace." He left without another word. Eleanor filed the supplier comparison in its proper place and went back to work. The weeks were long in the best way, full of actual problems that had actual solutions, once someone applied the sustained attention they required. She fell into a rhythm with Mrs. Fellows that was efficient and occasionally warm, the older woman developing the habit of appearing in the estate office at precisely 4 o'clock with tea and a remark about whichever member of the household had most recently tried her patience. She and Birch resolved the drainage question in week 5. The builder's estimate came in at £190, spread across 2 fields and 2 seasons, and Eleanor took the estimate to the Duke's study with a proposed repayment structure worked through tenant rental adjustments that would net the estate even over 6 years. He read it at his desk while she stood across from him. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He read it through twice. He asked 2 questions about the rental adjustment assumptions, which she answered. He said, "Take it to Birch and confirm he'll accept the terms." She took it to Birch. He accepted the terms. He shook her hand when she left, which was not something he had done in any previous meeting. The private accumulation of something she did not have a ready name for happened, as these things do, in the margins of practical work. It happened in the library at midnight, 3 weeks after she arrived, when she had gone to find the estate's original charter documents and found the Duke already there. reading by the fire, not in his chair but in the armchair by the shelves, without his coat, in shirt sleeves, with the fire half down, a book open on the arm. He looked up when she came in, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then he said, "The charter documents are on the third shelf, second section from the left." He had been there before her. It happened in the garden, 5 weeks in, when she had gone out in the early morning to walk the kitchen garden and check the condition of the frost-damaged beds. It was a practical matter, because the kitchen garden's failure meant purchasing from market, which was a supply chain question, and he had come around the corner of the west wing at 7 in the morning without his hat, and stopped when he saw her, and then fallen into step beside her without asking permission or being invited. And they had walked the full perimeter of the garden without speaking much, and what speaking there was had been about the kitchen garden, and then had moved, gradually, to the kitchen gardens his mother had kept, which he remembered as producing lavender in the summer, and which had not produced lavender in approximately 15 years. She filed this fact in the particular place she kept information that mattered. The following Monday, she wrote to a nursery in Somerset about lavender roots. It happened in the music room. She had known the music room was shut. Mrs. Fellows had told her, on the first day, matter-of-factly, that the West music room had not been opened in 14 years, and was not a subject the Duke discussed, and Eleanor had filed this information where it belonged, and did not raise it. But the music room was on the route between the estate office and the West Wing, and in the second month she began to hear, occasionally, at night, music from behind the door, not full playing, but the particular sound of a single melody, repeated in the way someone plays when they are working out a memory. She did not open the door. She was passing it on a Tuesday evening, when the music stopped mid-phrase, and his voice came through, "Come in, if you want to." She opened the door. The room was lit by 2 candles on the piano. He was seated at it, still in his evening clothes from a dinner she had organized but not attended. The piano was a good one. She could hear that from the 2 notes he had just played. The room smelled of old lavender and cold and something she could not name but recognized as the smell of a place that had been long shut and recently opened. She came in. She did not sit. She stood at a reasonable distance and looked at the piano. "It needs tuning," he said. "The lower octave," she agreed. He looked at her. "You play." "I did," she said. "I haven't had access to an instrument in several years." He moved along the bench, not with invitation exactly, with the act of creating space that anyone who chose could fill. She sat. She played a few bars of something, a Clementi sonatina, the one she had practiced the most before the Wiltshire house was sold, and then she stopped, because the lower octave was genuinely sharp and it was distracting. "My mother used to play in here," he said, "after supper, when she thought I was asleep." Eleanor said nothing. "She had a specific piece. I don't know its name. I've been trying to—" He stopped. He played 3 notes. It started like this. Eleanor listened. She pressed 2 more notes after his 3, tentatively, then 3 more. He looked at her. "I'm guessing," she said, "it might go this way." She played the phrase. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's it." They sat in the almost dark music room and she played the melody through twice, guessing at the middle section, until she had it close enough that he said quietly, "Yes, that's close to what I remember." He did not say anything after that. He sat beside her on the piano bench with his hands in his lap while she played, and the fire had gone completely out in that room years ago, but neither of them mentioned the cold. She played it a 3rd time, and the 4th time she played it cleanly. She noticed, because she noticed everything, that his posture had changed, not dramatically, like armor that has been wearing for a very long time and has, in a specific moment, been laid down without ceremony. She finished the piece. She sat for a moment. "Your cravat has been crooked since dinner," she said. He turned to look at her. 40 minutes at least, she said. Left side. He reached for it, and she reached at the same moment, and adjusted it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone correcting an administrative error. 2 quick movements of her fingers, and then she removed her hands and returned them to her lap and looked at the piano. He said nothing for 3 full seconds. "Thank you," he said. It was not nothing. It was not everything. It was the particular quality of a man being tended to by someone who was not performing tenderness, simply attending to a fact, and finding, not because he was a sentimental man but because he was a precise one, that this was the most remarkable thing anyone had done for him in a very long time. He did not say this. She did not say anything. She closed the piano lid and stood and went back to the estate office, and he sat in the music room for another quarter hour before he went to bed. The order of events, when they came quickly. The Sinclair wool merchant, a man called Pruitt, trading through a London wholesaler, responded to the renegotiated contract terms with a counter-proposal that reintroduced the quarterly pricing revision clause in different language. Eleanor found it on a Thursday morning while reviewing the response documents. It was Clause 12, subsection 4, written in the particular legal shorthand that was meant to look like standard language and was not. She wrote her analysis on a single page, attached the original clause from the 1814 contract alongside the new language, highlighted the structural equivalents with marginal annotations, and walked to the Duke's study. "He's offered the same clause," she said, "different language, same effect." He read it. He read the annotation. "What do you recommend?" he said. "We reject the counter and send him the revised clause directly. If he won't accept a fixed price structure with written notice requirements, we identify a new merchant. I have 2 alternatives in the county that can match his volume. How long to switch? 8 weeks to transition. 6 if we start the relationship now in parallel." He looked at the clause. He looked at her. "Write the rejection letter," he said, "and begin the parallel relationship." She wrote the rejection letter that afternoon. She also wrote a letter to the Earl of Hadley, not on instruction, on her own judgment, summarizing the clause issue and the recovery approach, because Hadley had asked about the wool contract and she believed in keeping relevant parties accurately informed. Hadley's response came within a week. It was addressed to the Duke, but it contained a line she learned about from James himself. "Your estate manager appears to know what she is doing. I was wrong to question it." It was not warmth. It was the acknowledgement of a precise man who had reviewed the evidence and changed his position, which was, in its way, everything. Eleanor was in the estate office when James came to tell her. He handed her Hadley's letter, opened to the relevant page. She read the line. She set the letter on the desk. She picked up her pencil and returned to the supplier comparison she had been working on. She did not smile immediately, not from withholding, but because the feeling required a moment to settle, like a stone dropped into still water that takes a breath to find its level. Then she smiled, briefly, privately, in the direction of the supplier comparison. "He read the wool contract analysis," she said. "He read everything you prepared," the Duke said. "I believe he spent an afternoon on it." "He's right that it's sound," she said. He looked at her with the expression he wore when she said something that was completely accurate and slightly extraordinary. "Yes," he said, "he is." The crisis that required Eleanor to stand in a room full of people and make the truth undeniable did not announce itself as a crisis until a Monday in March, when a letter arrived from London, addressed to the Duke and marked with the seal of a firm called Whitmore and Associates. Whitmore and Associates represented a consortium of investors who had advanced money against the Sinclair estate wool operation in 1813, during the 4th Duke's final illness, against a collateral agreement that the current Duke, as heir, had inherited without knowing it existed. The letter informed His Grace that the consortium considered the agreement in default. on the basis that the estate's wool supply contract renegotiation had disrupted their expected return, and intended to pursue recovery against the estate property. Eleanor read the letter. She read it again. She went to the estate records and pulled the 1813 agreement, which was filed in the fourth position of the third drawer of the back cabinet, and had apparently not been reviewed since the day it was signed. She read it with the careful attention of someone who has learned that the important thing is always in the part that does not look important. The collateral agreement was contingent on a specific provision, that the wool supply contract be renewed on substantially similar terms to the 1811 original. The 1811 original had been the contract with the quarterly pricing clause, the very clause she had renegotiated out, which meant, theoretically, that she had created the default. She brought this to the Duke at 6 o'clock in the evening and explained it without preamble. He listened. He did not react publicly. "The clause she renegotiated," he said finally. "Yes," she said, "which was overcharging the estate £400 annually." "Yes, and the collateral agreement made the overcharge a condition of the loan structure. The way I read it, yes. I've asked Edward Marsh, your solicitor, to review my reading. He's coming Thursday." He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, but with the particular stillness of a man calculating. "What do you think Marsh will say?" he said. "I think he'll say the agreement is technically valid but unenforceable on public policy grounds," she said. "You cannot construct a loan that requires a counterparty to accept fraudulent pricing as a condition. But I want his view before I say that with confidence. And if he says it's enforceable, then we go to the investor consortium with the full pricing history and the recovery claim," she said. "They've been benefiting from the overcharge since 1814. Their claim against the estate is smaller than what the estate could claim against them if we present the full picture." He looked at her. "You've thought this through," he said. "Since this morning," she said. "I've had several hours." He stood. He crossed to the window. He stood there for a moment with his hands behind his back. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. He had not used her given name before. He used it now without emphasis, without particular weight, simply as the word that accurately identified the person in the room he was speaking to. This was its own kind of precision. "You did not cause this problem," he said. "You found it. There is a difference." She held this for a moment without response. "The renegotiation was correct," she said. "I would do it again." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm saying." She understood what he was saying. She picked up her pencil and went back to her notes and did not say anything else, and he stayed at the window for another moment before returning to his desk, and neither of them addressed the particular quality of the air in the study that evening, which was different from what it had been before he said her name. Marsh arrived on Thursday. He read the agreement for 45 minutes. He read Eleanor's analysis. He asked her 2 questions, both of which she answered with specific textual references. He looked at her over his reading spectacles with the expression of a man who has not been surprised often and has just been surprised. "The public policy argument is strong," he said. "It's not settled law, but the precedent is favorable. If they bring this to a formal inquiry, a creditor's hearing, you present the pricing history and the recovery claim, and you let the numbers speak." "Can she present?" the Duke said. "As a state manager?" Marsh looked at Eleanor. He looked at the Duke. He looked back at Eleanor. "She prepared the analysis," he said. "She is the appropriate person to present it." He paused. "I've been in estate practice for 30 years. I would be glad to present it alongside her." The hearing was convened on the 1st of April, in a rented room at the Marlborough Assembly Hall. The consortium sent 2 representatives, a solicitor and a man named Alderton, who was the consortium's senior investor. 50s, broad, with the particular authority of someone who has been the largest figure in every room he has entered for 20 years. The room held 14 people, the consortium's representatives, the estate's legal team including Marsh, the Duke, Lord Hadley, who had come without being asked, and 3 witnesses the consortium had brought as though expecting a proceeding that would be primarily social. Eleanor stood at the table. She had brought 3 bound documents and a single annotated summary page. She said, "I'll begin with the 1811 contract." She opened the first document. Clause 7 of the original agreement established a fixed annual price with written notice, required for any revision. In June 1814, Clause 7 was revised by the merchant without written notice as required by the contract. I have attached here the original correspondence and the 1814 invoices showing the price change, which was implemented without the required notice and without the estate's formal acknowledgement. She turned to the second document. This is the full invoice record from 1814 to 1816. The estate was overcharged by a consistent margin of approximately £400 annually. The total overpayment across 3 years was £1,240. She let this number sit in the room for a moment. She did not look at Alderton. She looked at the paper. The 1813 collateral agreement, she continued, turning to the third document. Conditions default on the estate's failure to renew the wool contract on substantially similar terms to the 1811 original. The 1811 original included fixed pricing. The contract the estate has renegotiated includes fixed pricing. The principal distinction between the 1811 original and the current negotiated contract is the removal of the unauthorized pricing revision clause added in 1814, a clause that was itself a breach of the 1811 original. She looked up. The estate has not defaulted on the 1813 agreement. The estate has restored the original contract structure. The default, if there is one, belongs to the party who revised the pricing without authorization in 1814. The room was quiet. Alderton's solicitor said, "The 1814 revision was accepted by the estate without objection for 3 years. The estate was not aware of the specific clause change," Eleanor said. "Acceptance without knowledge is not acceptance under contract law. Mr. Marsh can address the legal standard if needed." Marsh addressed it, precisely and at length. The consortium's solicitor wrote something on his paper. Alderton had not spoken. He was looking at the annotated summary page, which Eleanor had placed in front of each participant at the start of the hearing, and which laid out the timeline, the figures, and the argument in 12 clear lines. He said, finally, "You prepared this?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "You've been the estate manager for how long?" "Since January," she said. 13 weeks. The room did not erupt. There was a long moment in which the mathematics of the situation resolved themselves in the minds of the people present. Alderton said to his solicitor, "Our claim is weaker than their recovery claim." His solicitor said, "Yes." Alderton looked at Eleanor. He looked at the Duke, who was standing to Eleanor's left in complete stillness. He said, "We'll need to review our position." "Of course," Marsh said. "We'll expect your response within 14 days. Lord Hadley, from the back of the room, said nothing. He was looking at Eleanor with the expression of a man making a final private accounting. She stacked her documents. She did not allow herself any expression. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and today the room had finally looked, and she was not going to give it a performance of what that felt like, because she did not actually know yet, and she needed the carriage ride home to find out. The Duke was beside her before she reached the door. He did not take her arm. He did not say anything. He simply stood beside her at the door and held it open, and when they came out into the April afternoon, the light was coming across the square at a low angle, and he looked at her and said, That was 29 of the 37 investors' questions in 12 lines. She looked at him. There were only 12 that mattered, she said. He looked at her with the expression that was his version of the feeling he had not yet named aloud. He said, "Eleanor." And then, in the square outside the Marlborough Assembly Hall, with Marsh and Hadley coming through the door behind them, he took her hand, her bare hand, where her glove had slipped, warm against the April cold, and did not immediately let go, and when Hadley cleared his throat coming through the door, they both turned, and there was a moment in which Hadley looked at their hands, and looked at the Duke's face, and said quietly, "I see," which was all he said, and which was everything. The proposal came twice, as things that matter do. The first was practical and public, and happened 2 weeks later in the drawing room at Sinclair House, with Mrs. Fellows and Marsh present as witnesses, because the social question had become unavoidable, and the Duke addressed unavoidable things directly. He asked Eleanor to marry him in the particular language of a man offering something real, not something ceremonial, and she said she would consider it, which she meant literally, and which he received without impatience. She considered it for 3 days. She thought about it the way she thought about the drainage estimate or the wool contract, completely, from multiple angles, with the specific attention she gave to decisions that could not be easily reversed. On the third evening, she went to the music room. He was there, as she had thought he might be. The room had been in regular use since February, aired and recanopied and newly supplied with candles. The piano had been tuned by a man from Bath. The lavender roots from Somerset had arrived and been planted by the kitchen garden wall. She sat beside him on the bench and played his mother's melody from beginning to end, cleanly and without interruption, because she had practiced it for the past week and she could now play it through completely. When she finished, she set her hands in her lap. She said yes. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. He said, "Not because of the position, not because of Sinclair House." "No," she agreed. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes," he said, "but because you sat in this room and found the melody I had been trying to remember for 20 years, and you straightened my cravat, and you told the investor consortium the truth in 12 lines, and I have not met anyone in my entire life who does the world the specific justice you do it." She held this. She pressed one hand briefly to the piano keys. Not playing, simply the warm solidity of it. "I know," she said, and then, "Your cravat is straight, by the way." He looked at her. He laughed. A real one, short and genuine, the sound of a man who does not do it often enough. He kissed her hand, both of them actually unhurried. They were married in June, at the church in the village nearest to Sinclair House, with Mrs. Fellows in her best dress, and Birch and his wife in the third pew, and Marsh making his way up the aisle, with the deliberate pace of a man who has attended many consequential events, and recognizes this as one. Lord Hadley came. He said nothing personal, but he was there, and he stayed for the wedding supper, and at the end of the evening he found Eleanor in the morning room, reviewing a stack of correspondence that had arrived that afternoon, and he stood in the doorway and said, "I made an error in my initial assessment of your capabilities, Mrs. Sinclair. I hope you will accept an acknowledgement of that." She looked up from the correspondence. "I do," she said. He nodded once and left, and she returned to the letter she had been reading. Lady Caroline Fenn married Sir Edmund Holt that autumn in London. The wedding was reported in the papers as elegant. Eleanor read the notice over breakfast and returned to the drainage report from the North Farms, which showed a 22% improvement in the winter barley yield and needed to be shared with Birch. The sapphires were in the Sinclair house vault. Eleanor had catalogued them herself, as part of the estate inventory she completed in September. She had no particular feeling about them. The professional legacy was specific. Eleanor Voss Sinclair spent the next 6 years restructuring the Sinclair estate's operational model, and the annotated account system she developed, the consolidated purchasing ledger, the tenant renewal template, the supplier comparison structure, was adopted by 3 neighboring estates after their managers came to ask how the Sinclair accounts had achieved their current clarity. She wrote the methodology in a plain document with no ornamentation and distributed it at cost, and by 1825 it was in use across 7 estates in Wiltshire and 2 in Somerset. The heir to the Sinclair dukedom was born in the spring of 1819 and named Thomas James Sinclair, for her father and for his. He arrived with her precision and his father's stillness, and by the time he could walk he was already attempting to organize the nursery's movable objects into rows, which Mrs. Fellows found delightful and Eleanor found logical. On a morning in late autumn of that year, with the lavender finally established along the kitchen garden wall and the light coming through the west windows at a low angle, Eleanor was at the estate desk reviewing the tenant accounts when she heard the particular sound of small feet escaping from the nursery above and making for the main stair with purpose. She went to the corridor. Thomas was on the landing, having successfully negotiated the first 3 steps, and stopped at the 4th, which had been repaired in February of 1817, and was now perfectly sound, but which he regarded with suspicion. She went up and collected him under one arm, and he said the 4 words he said most frequently, which were counting, and down, and go, and now. And she carried him down the stair properly, and set him in the corridor, and he immediately went to find his father. She heard him find him, the particular sound of a small person launching themselves at a tall one who caught them without warning and held them without drama. She returned to the estate desk. She could hear them in the corridor, James's voice, low, and Thomas's, higher, asking for something with repetitive confidence. She knew without looking that James was standing in the corridor with Thomas in his arms, watching the door of the estate office. She could feel it with the particular certainty of a woman who has learned to read the quality of a silence, whether it is empty or occupied, whether the person in the corridor is merely present or is paying attention. She finished the line she was writing. She set down the pencil. She turned in the chair. He was in the doorway, Thomas balanced on one arm, watching her with the expression she had come to know as his version of the thing that had no single word. Not pride, not longing, not relief, but something older and steadier than any of those. The expression of a man who has found what he was looking for and intends to go on finding it, quietly, for the rest of the time he has. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She never had been. The world had simply at long last arranged itself to admit it.